1971. This is the state of the Vietnam War. The United States was withdrawing out of South Vietnam, and South Vietnam was itself being equipped to continue the war on its own. Vietnamization was underway. Between 1969 and 1972, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, expanded from 825,000 to over 1 million men. To facilitate this, American military aid sent over 1 million M16s, 40,000 radios, 20,000 trucks, and military aircraft like the A-1, A-37, and F-5 fighters. The American Military Assistance Command Vietnam, or MACV, focused on building military schools to create more capable officers, and 12,000 ARVN officers were brought to the United States for advanced training. At the same time, the US military was pulling out. From a 1968 peak of almost 600,000 combat troops, by January 1972, only 158,120 were left in South Vietnam. An additional 58,000 would be withdrawn between February and April. By March, only 2 combat brigades would remain in Vietnam. Even with these withdrawals, the South Vietnamese military was growing. It was slowly filling in the shoes left behind by Allied forces. The South Vietnamese government was finding its footholds even during the war. Under Nguyễn, the government had been stable for about 5 years. The leadership structure was set, and all generals obeyed the president without trying to overthrow him. Pacification was also making steady progress in the countryside. The Cambodian incursion in 1970 had severely damaged communist logistic lines on the southern part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Because of this, in 3 and 4 Corps, communist forces did not have the influence and strongholds it had in the mid-1960s. In these areas, their only major bases were all in Cambodia. The only major North Vietnamese bases within the country were in I and II Corps, typically protected by mountains. But on the coast and major population centers, the South Vietnamese government had total control. Vietnamization appeared to be working. By contrast, North Vietnam's economy was faltering. After heavy American bombing campaigns, the country was shattered industrially and agriculturally. Even 3 years after the stop of strategic bombing, the rice crop only grew from 4 million metric tons to 5 million in the period of 1968 to 1971. The factories, coal exports, and storage facilities were destroyed. Electric capacity was only at 1/3. Because of this, many North Vietnamese leaders, like Prime Minister Trung Trinh, wanted to focus on rebuilding the country rather than attacking the South. Only after rebuilding the economy could they start to think of engaging South Vietnam again. However, North Vietnam did not really have a manufacturing weapons base that could be bombed in the first place. Most of its military supplies came straight from its communist sponsors in the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. Because of this, even with the bombing, the People's Army of Vietnam, or PAVN, was still able to be equipped for war. But because of the military failure of the Tet Offensive in 1968, North Vietnamese leadership was extremely hesitant to execute any major offensives. They had previously concluded that another all-out offensive would be far too costly and give minimal gains. The Tet Offensive had failed them 3 years ago, and now, South Vietnam was only stronger. By 1971, the North Vietnamese were on the defensive, trying to rebuild from previous Allied operations, rather than conduct attacks themselves. But then, Operation Làm Sơn 719 kicked off. It was an operation conducted by the South Vietnamese Airborne and 1st Divisions, some of South Vietnam's best infantry units, into Laos. The operation's objective was to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail at the Chapone Junction, destroying supplies and troops on the way to South Vietnam to fight. However, due to South Vietnamese inexperience and American miscommunication, the operation failed, and South Vietnamese units had to retreat chaotically with heavy casualties. But for the North Vietnamese, they did not manage to exploit the situation either. North Vietnamese units did not counterattack successfully until South Vietnamese forces were already withdrawing. It was the first time North Vietnamese soldiers attempted to use armor and heavy artillery together with infantry, and it was a mess. Dozens of tanks were destroyed as a result. While the operation was a failure for South Vietnam, it wasn't a success for the North either. However, the North Vietnamese leadership could clearly see that while South Vietnam was steadily gaining strength, it was still very much trying to figure out how to operate independently from the US. Seeing the results of Làm Sơn 719 and North Vietnam's faltering campaign in South Vietnam, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Lê Duẩn, decided that another offensive must be launched. The North Vietnamese had to act now. At this point, Vietnamization was still in progress. The longer the North Vietnamese waited, the stronger the South Vietnamese army became. Additionally, the Americans were not quite out yet. If this offensive went well, the North Vietnamese could claim that they defeated American soldiers on the field and disgraced the Americans internationally. Lê Duẩn managed to convince the rest of the Politburo to launch this offensive in the following year of 1972. For this new offensive, called the Nguyễn Offensive, North Vietnam would use combined arms warfare. To achieve this, Hanoi appealed to both the Soviet Union and China. Both countries were normalizing their relationships with the Americans, but it begged the question, who were the true communists? Nixon was planning to visit China, and Hanoi took the opportunity to accuse the Americans of taking actions to divide the communist world. The Chinese saw that the accusations also implicated them, and immediately sent down a diplomat to guarantee Hanoi continued support in person. Moscow saw the Chinese move, and they themselves sent down a representative to promise aid. While both Moscow and Beijing were talking with the Americans, they still had to demonstrate that they continued to support the People's Communist Revolution on the international stage. North Vietnam immediately received 2,000 new trucks and 10,000 tons of oil and gasoline. US intelligence estimated that North Vietnamese aid from both the Chinese and Soviets would be around $1.5 billion during this period in time. Additionally, the Soviets shipped the North Vietnamese T-54 main battle tanks and 130mm howitzers. The T-54 was comparable to the American M48 Patton MBT, but with significant quality issues. The 130mm howitzer, however, was state-of-the-art and outranged everything the Americans and South Vietnamese had, except for the 175mm howitzer, which was quite rare and wildly inaccurate at long ranges. The Soviets also started delivering the AT-3 Stagger anti-tank and SA-7 anti-aircraft guided missiles. 3,000 North Vietnamese crewmen were sent straight to the Soviet Union to learn how to use the T-54s. By the end of 1971, 20 whole battalions of tanks and heavy equipment, along with the 320A Division and other independent regiments and battalions, were sent straight to the south. With all of this, the North Vietnamese were handsomely equipped for the offensive. The Nguyễn offensive would consist of 3 massive combined arms prongs hitting 3 major locations at the same time, and it was aimed for the 1972 dry season at the end of March. The South Vietnamese and Americans have never faced anything like this before in Vietnam.